Welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio, exploring the frontiers of spirituality, consciousness, the esoteric, and humanity's sacred relationship with the living earth. I'm your host, Nick Mather, and in this episode I speak with Eric Wargo, author of Time Loops and the recently released Precognitive Dreamwork in the Long Self. Eric discusses his theory of precognitive dreaming, which he argues is a kind of memory of the future. He shares his thoughts on why science rejects well-evidenced phenomena like precognition as pseudoscience and the need for citizen scientists. He talks about the often mundane nature of precognitive dreams, Freud and Jung, and what he believes to be the true nature of synchronicity. Eric Wargo has a PhD in anthropology from Emory University and works as a science writer and editor in Washington, D.C. In his spare time, he writes about science fiction, consciousness, and the paranormal at his popular blog, The Nightshirt. He is the author of Time Loops and Precognitive Dreamwork in the Long Self. Eric Wargo, welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio.
Thank you for having me.
I always appreciate speaking with another dreamer. I think that we're kind of few and far between these days. So I always welcome that. And I found your book, Precognitive Dreamwork in the Long Self, to be a bit of a mind blower in all the best ways. In fact, I'm still sort of ruminating over it. Some of it was a little bit challenging for me because I've always been more aligned to the thinking of Jung rather than Freud. And you seem to favor Freud. And I hope we can get into that a bit.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'm always open to having my ideas challenged. And I've had precognitive dreams. So I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to speak with you today. There's a lot I want to talk to you about, but I think the first question I'll ask is, where does your interest in precognitive dreams and the paranormal come from?
Yeah, well, it's a big question. The interest in the paranormal really, I don't know. I think as I look back on it, it's sort of been growing for a couple decades, but it really went to a new level when I had a couple of UFO sightings in 2009, and they weren't high strangeness, experiences. I wasn't abducted. They were just lights in the sky, but they were, very unusual and prompted me to start reading into the subject. And as I read into the subject, I realized that it had tendrils to a much larger domain of human experience, namely psychic phenomena. And while I had been I had been raised pretty much a materialist scientist and so on. My parents were scientists, and I didn't have deep problems with UFOs, but I definitely had problems with the idea of ESP. That was not something that fit into my world picture at that point. And but I did my due diligence and started reading about the subject and discovered, hey, there's something here, and this is really interesting that mainstream science just doesn't want to hear about. And then in 2011, Daryl Bem, who is an eminent Cornell University psychologist, very big name psychologist, came out with a paper in a major journal. And I at that point was working as the editorial director of another psychological science organization. So that's how I came across his paper. And it was reporting the results of some studies in what is called presentiment. That is, he was reversing the temporal sequence of some basic psychological paradigms, things like priming, facilitation of recall, a few other things, and got these significant results that students, undergraduates in his studies, would pre-spawned to stimuli, and behaviorally, make choices on a computer screen or whatever that seemed to be influenced by things that they were going to be encountering subsequent to their response. And it was really mind-blowing, very mind-blowing paper. It's called Feeling the Future. And he'd been doing this sort of research for a long time, alongside his other research. And this kind of result, gets published all the time in little tiny parapsychology journals and so on. But this was, he got it through peer review in a major journal, and it just made people flip out. Psychologists were so angry about this. And I saw the anger in my colleagues, who were considering writing a letter to the journal and saying this is preposterous and should never be published. The idea being that, well, if the public starts seeing psychology as being about ESP, it'll ruin the reputation of the field. And wow, I really got it was an eye opener. And I think I have a kind of underdog radar that starts flashing when I see what looks like kind of systematic bullying of an unpopular or strange, unfamiliar idea. And that's really what it looked like to me. And boy, that told me, hey, there is something here. If only in, why does it push these buttons? Right. And so that really sent me down the path of studying ESP research. At that point, I was, doing a lot of, research and practice in remote viewing and stuff. But the precognition side of it, there's, ESP is generally divided into three modalities. There's telepathy, clairvoyance or remote viewing, and precognition. And precognition is kind of the most outrageous of those three somehow to people. And it kind of didn't get studied extensively until later than these other modalities. But actually the data in support of it are very, very strong. And there's even an argument to be made. And I engage in these debates with remote viewers that other forms of ESP supposedly are really precognition in disguise. And I talk a little bit in my books about why that's an interesting way of looking at the problem. There's no proof at this point, one way or the other. But in any event, I really started doing extensive reading and study of parapsychology at that point. And of course, I was investigating it in my own life. And being a dreamer and having studied my own dreams for decades at that point, I mean, I kept a daily dream journal. I, had been steeped in Freud and Lacan and stuff in graduate school. And then I got into Jung about 20 years ago. And so I was really familiar with mainstream psychoanalytic and new age dream interpretation, methods. And and the topic of precognitive dreaming had never come up in those literatures. But I realized, well, wait, I've had these too, and I kind of swept them under the rug, as one does. You have a weird experience, paranormal experience of whatever kind. The tendency is to just, well, that was strange, and maybe it felt life-altering even at the moment, but then kind of doubt creeps in, and in hindsight, well, maybe I was imagining, or whatever. I had a precognitive dream on the morning of 9/11, which I talk about in my book, and a few others. And so I started really studying my dreams with this possibility in mind. And boom, I mean, it was like turning on a light switch. The moment you start paying attention to this possibility of dreams foreshadowing future experiences in your life, often imminent experiences in your life, often within minutes of waking, often over the next day or two, but sometimes over the span of weeks, months, years, decades even. And if you have a detailed dream journal, you can start to examine that possibility. It was a really a very paradigm altering thing for me. And it didn't happen overnight. I mean, you have these experiences and they go, God, this is mind blowing. I had a dream about, this scene in a movie that I watched the next day, and it's like, it's impossible. It defies everything we know about time and consciousness and everything else. And yet doubt creeps in. You have to sort of have these experiences again and again and again. And it's that repetition of realizing that, wow, the mind brain, whatever you want to call it, works in a very different way than any of our assumptions. And time, and it upholds actually a very classical idea about time that goes back to Einstein, really, and that's actually not really questioned by most or by many physicists, yet we kind of just ignore it because it doesn't fit with our experience. But that's the idea that we live in a four-dimensional space-time continuum. It's what Einstein's discoveries led to, and his math teacher Hermann Minkowski called it a block universe. And this block universe model, says that, imagine space-time is a four-dimensional block. We can't imagine those four dimensions, but just imagine there's two dimensions of space and one dimension of time, and that we are world lines. Objects and particles and people are all lines snaking through that block for a certain length, of that block, and that the present moment is a cross section of that four-dimensional reality. So we're really, I feel like I'm, I see a body here and so forth. I see you sitting there, but we're both really space-time worms, snaking through the four-dimensional block. And that's the reality that precognition totally supports. So there's, on the one hand, there's this validation from kind of the most theoretical, relativistic cosmology and lived experience of many people. When I published my first book, Time Loops, which was sort of more theoretical about how precognition might work, I went into dreams a bit because that's sort of the classical way that people tend to experience it. But I also talked a lot about how it worked, manifests in art and creativity and so forth. But after I wrote that, I got bombarded by people telling me their precognitive dream stories and wanting insight about them, because these things can be very troubling for people. You might have people, again and again and again, I get emails from people who've had premonitions of a loved one's death or a disaster in the news, and these things unfold because they had a dream about it beforehand, and then they feel guilty, or they feel just a lot of troubled emotions. Did I cause it? Am I responsible? Could I have done something? Could I have warned the person? All these thoughts go through people's heads. And I think I even say in the new book that I think this kind of guilt and disturbance that people feel around premonitions specifically is a major mental health consequence of this thus far unacknowledged capacity, and I'd say constant feature of our psychology. So this is consequential. This is not just it's not about it's not just about developing some new superpower and not just a novelty. I mean, it really has consequence in people's lives, and if they don't understand it, or if they have confused understandings about it, maybe based on folklore or based on their own cultural belief systems or things they've read in cheap ESP books instead of expensive ESP books,
right.
That it can have real consequences. So I realized, okay, someone needs to write a real guidebook here, and I had over the years amassed kind of a lot of experience in interpreting dreams and looking for precognition in dreams, and figuring out the tricks of the brain that sort of keep it hidden. And so yeah, that was the impetus for the new book. And this is a long answer to your initial question, but that's
fine.
My path.
Yeah. No, there's a lot to kind of unpack in that. So the first question I wanted to ask is, you mentioned the article by Daryl Bem, and that it was met with anger from the psychological community. Where do you think that anger was coming from?
That's a great question. There are, first of all, it's such a dogma in psychology that, and I think any professional working in the field, whether, you know, however closed-minded or open-minded they personally are, there's, you know, they have been indoctrinated, really. I mean, every professional, no matter what the field, is indoctrinated. You know, we're all indoctrinated. So I'm not singling out psychology, but you know, in their Psych 101 textbooks, you know, there's a section on pseudoscience. Okay. And right there in those chapters on pseudoscience is the, you know, the embarrassing history of parapsychology, and which is not really embarrassing. It's you know, it's had very legitimate, respectable researchers, and has amassed, in fact, quite a lot of good and compelling science. But there's also, it's, you know, the shady and not quite up to snuff practitioners, and those are the ones that get singled out. So there's this reputation of pseudoscience that attaches to it. And boy, the last, you know, that is, any taint of pseudoscience is really, a legitimate scientist wants to avoid that as much as possible. And psychology is particularly sensitive to that because of its history. Psychology has always had to defend itself as a hard science against charges and claims by other kinds of scientists that, well, what you're doing isn't really science. You know, that's always been the kind of there in the background of psychology, and that's driven psychology to be very careful of its reputation, and to develop, you know, advanced methods that seemingly increase the rigor and reproducibility of its results and so on. In fact, you know, the reality is it's got problems. It's got real problems. And one of the ironies, one of the really interesting ironies of Daryl Bem's paper was that it provoked a real soul searching in the field, because psychologists thought, well, if this pseudoscience is getting published and this passed peer review, and his statistical methods look okay, well, then clearly there's something wrong, and we need to investigate why this kind of thing is making it through the publication process. And as we know from, you know, the last 10 years, the big story across all the sciences, and especially in psychology, has been the replication crisis. I mean, studies after studies fail to replicate. And, you know, they get pushed out on TED Talks, and people make their careers on some little slightly counterintuitive, but not too counterintuitive finding that, you know, sounds great, and then it fails to replicate in further studies. But by the time those failed replications occur, everyone has moved on, and they just assume that what they read in that one interesting study is true. And so this is a super big problem. And it goes across a lot of sciences. It's true in the health sciences and so on as well. But so it you know, this Daryl Bem's paper catalyzed this intensified look at psychology, and there was a team then formed to redo all the experiments in like a year's worth of some of the top journals and see how many could replicate, and they found some appalling figure that less than half, I think, replicated. It provoked a lot of discussion. The irony is that Daryl Bem's studies have replicated very well. There were initial claims. The skeptics all came out of the woodwork saying, yes, this can't be replicated, and yeah, we tried this, and that we got no results, and this is BS. In fact, something like, I think there was 87 independent replications of some of his studies that got the same results he got, and the statistical likelihood of that being a fluke is vanishingly small. So his work is sound, and there's a lot of very statistically sound research showing the same thing, or showing variants of the same thing, the idea that we get information from our future somehow. And one of the former heads of the American Statistical Association or whatever is one of the allies of parapsychology, and she again and again will tell you that it is, the statistics show that this is real, and no one wants to hear it. No one in psychology wants to hear it. No one in other fields wants to hear it, but they're going to have to listen eventually because it's real.
Yeah, I can relate. One of the classes that I teach on a regular basis is logic. And one of the things I'm supposed to discuss is pseudoscience. And in every logic book, essentially all it does is says, yeah, this isn't real. And I can't in good conscience stand in front of a class of students and just indoctrinate them that way, when I know that there's evidence in support of some of these things. You mentioned Daryl Beam. I know that Dean Radin has done some really good work, and some others. And it's, from my point of view, I think it's fascinating in some aspects, in the sense that, and this is where I really appreciate your work, because I think it's vital to like philosophy and religious studies to look at these things and take them seriously. I understand you're friends with Jeffrey Kripal, and that's why I really appreciate his work, because he's taking these things seriously. And I often think in terms of science, in the sort of the history of science, there's Thomas Kuhn and the revolutions of, scientific paradigms. And what drives the shift into a new paradigm are anomalies. And I think consciousness is the anomaly that's going to shift us into the next paradigm. And that's not going to happen if people just have blinders on and say, yeah, this isn't happening.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
So, but just along these lines, I think you've already answered this, but what do you say to these skeptics who just automatically reject it? I mean, you just kind of point out that, yeah, they've done these studies. Is there any way to convince them?
No, no, there's not. And honestly, you can ask me that question. That's an interesting question, but I've never had to confront it. No skeptic has ever confronted me about this directly.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what I would say. I'd probably get all tongue tied, because it's like there's I've done 10 years of research on this. Read my books,
Right.
Read my books, get back to me after you've actually read what I say in my books, and considered, the massive evidence, both from scientific research, although for me, honestly, the science only goes so far in helping both prove and understand what's going on. We really need to draw honestly on human experience and subjective experience. And yeah, for scientists, that's anecdotal. Right. But when the anecdotes pile up like a mountain. And not only are they, so overwhelming in number, but they're consistent. They're consistent in very particular ways. And that's what really kind of drives my research, is finding those consistencies in these mountains of anecdote that point to something real. I often, there's different kinds of science. I think when we think of science, we think now of some person in a laboratory doing something that can be repeated, very, very carefully, and experimental science. But, there's also, what do we call exploration? It's not quite science, but, you can go to be an explorer in the 19th century and go into the Congo and see gorillas and come back and describe gorillas, and people aren't going to believe you, or some will believe you and some won't. Ultimately you just have to bring some gorillas out, and show them enough pictures, show them, let them experience a gorilla themselves. They will, that will change the conversation. Now, is that science? It's something on the border. And I think that's kind of what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to not only show people the, a lot of reports, I'm giving them the tools to experience it themselves. And that's what the new book is about. It's about turning people into citizen scientists, to look, the only way you're going to be convinced, if you're not convinced by this, just try it yourself, and see if you aren't convinced. And I've had some great testimonials, honestly, from and I kind of expected this, but I didn't make any promises in the book, but testimonials from readers saying, the first night I tried this, I had a precognitive dream, in some cases about something they were about to read in my book the next day. So it's like there's this fractal geometry going, and it's like, yep, that's the way this stuff works. And you start having those experiences. My hope is that I'll be part of, I think there are a lot of writers right now, a lot of people right now, including Jeffrey Keipel, who you mentioned, and others, who are really trying to change the conversation about paranormal phenomena in general and open people's minds. And I think there's a kind of younger generation of scholars too, who are a bit more open-minded and a little more skeptical of the skeptics. And I'm really hopeful that we'll get to a point soon where, some kind of young researcher will have their own precognitive dream experiences and realize, hey, I could make a name for myself by doing some studies and maybe getting some funding to study this, maybe in some sort of safe, maybe call it something different. My expectation is that this, everything I'm saying, or most of the things I'm saying in my books, will be validated by science sooner or later, but it's all going to have a different name. It's all going to be given different names, and none of us, liminal people out here in parapsychology land and studying the paranormal are ever going to get any credit for it. But all these phenomena will be validated and given sort of scientific imprimatur eventually under a new lexicon, a new vocabulary, which is fine. The point, the point is, I think that paradigm shift you're talking about, will happen, but it's not going to happen from the top down in the sense of experimental science. Someone finally, publishing one more study. There's a million studies supporting this. What happens to happen is people have to experience it in their own lives. They have to see the gorilla,
Let's talk a little bit about these, or a lot about these precognitive dreams. I mentioned that I've had precognitive dreams, and they have seemed to me to be a little bit different in a way from what you describe in the book. But I also had one right after reading your book, so I'll share that one with you. Okay. So for me, I've noticed that the precognitive dreams, because I've been keeping a record of my dreams as well for a good 30 years now. And They always seem to happen during very emotional moments or something that there's a great concern. So, but for me, often it's like a voice. When I was in Denver, I had been laid off from the University of Denver. And I didn't know what was going to happen. And I had this dream, and all I remember from the dream was this voice saying, your life will be very different a year from now. That was it. Yeah. And it was accurate.
Yeah. Sure.
I also noticed that, right now I'm an adjunct, unfortunately. And, the job security is always iffy. You never know if you're going to get enough classes to pay the bills. Right. But I will have dreams about that. I will have dreams that, that I get classes. Right. And I think those can fit into the model that you provide. But I also, and this is the experience I just had, was I had a dream just the other night, and I remember just this brief scene of a friend of mine, Charlie, appeared in the dream, and he was kind of upset in the dream. And then yesterday, I had the dream the other night. And so yesterday I log into Facebook, and you know how Facebook says, oh, you have a memory to share or something. And it was like, oh, you and Charlie have this memory. And I thought, is that it? Is that it? Because that just seems so mundane to me. Is that how this works? Is there, like a mundane aspect and then I don't know, like a special,
numinous is the word.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. I mean, what precognitive dream work teaches you is that the vast majority of precognitive dreams are very mundane. They're about these mundane things that you'll encounter on the internet the next day. I mean, for me, Twitter. I mean, I'm just, that's how I engage with the internet and social media and many of my precognitive dreams are about a picture, for instance, on Twitter, or some link on Twitter will lead me to some article that I'll read, and like come to a paragraph in the article, like, boom, that's like, I was dreaming this paragraph. And that's it's very, very common. I believe, or at least my hypothesis at this point, is that that's partly a function of the fact that we are dreaming about our whole life. We're dreaming about all the upheavals, even minor emotional upheavals in our day. I mean, like coming to like a really interesting article on something that, like, well, that's a slight upheaval in my day. It's like my life is really boring for the most part. And then, the mountain peaks, are really not peaks, but they're little hills. But those hills are what you're dreaming about, the kind of memorable things, slightly memorable things. And we're pre-metabolizing all of those experiences. But what we remember of our dreams is a teeny tiny fraction of that. Okay. So inevitably, if, we say you have, I'm just picking numbers at random. So you have 20 dreams at night, or dream about 20 experiences at night. You might remember one of those dreams. Now, and you might, over the course of a week, discover a link between one of those dreams and one subsequent experience in your life. Well, the odds are that it's going to be a dream about something relatively trivial, even though you're dreaming also about the more significant things too. So dream work, those dreams that rise to the top for people who aren't really doing precognitive dream work are the premonitions, like, having a dream about 9/11 and then 9/11 happens. Well, it's like, wow, it's pretty easy to remember that I had a dream kind of related to this as I'm watching it on CNN. Nobody who isn't paying attention to dreams is going to remember that Facebook notification that you have a memory, with, your friend. No one's going to make that link unless they are recording their dreams and then doing the key bit of precognitive dream work, which is going back to your recent dream records every night and reminding yourself what you were dreaming about and how it, and looking for those connections, because that's what very few people who keep a dream journal think to do, because they're not primed to think in terms of precognition. If you grew up with a Freudian background or a Jungian background, you're primed to look to the past. You assume that your dreams are somehow about your memories, about your past life, about long-standing things in your past leading up to now. You are not primed to be looking for connections to things that happen subsequent to the dream. And so it just requires that shift of mindset. But this phenomenon that you're noticing of so many dreams being, about trivial events is a real one. But really, when you start having these dreams, even about trivial events, it's mind blowing. I mean, when you think about how because those trivial events are very specific. They're not, dreaming about, dreaming about having lunch, like with, of course you had lunch the next day. Well, whatever. They're, dreams about very specific, impossible to predict, details about something that happened during that lunch, something that somebody said, that just couldn't be, couldn't be predicted. And that's what dreams are connecting you to. And it's just a truly mind-blowing experience to start having this happen to you, and realize then that you can replicate it and keep doing it. Just keep looking. It's just observe. It's mainly an observational kind of practice.
Yeah, and I meant no offense to Charlie with referring to it as being mundane, but and I should have added that, but your points were all taken. Is even in these sort of mundane experiences, it's amazing that you can have this like precognitive glimpse, right? And so I don't in any way want to downplay that. Now you mentioned memory, and I know that memory is a major part of the book. And isn't part of your argument that our memory extends into the future, that's kind of what we're doing? We're sort of remembering the future.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's exactly how it works. And a lot of, we mentioned those patterns that you start to see when the anecdotes accumulate. One of the patterns is that dreams are about our future experiences. And that's not intuitive. If you have the sort of a basic folkloric preconceptions about what ESP might be, that you're somehow sensing ripples from the planes hitting the Pentagon or planes hitting the towers or whatever, and it causes a dream somehow in your head. That's not how it seems to work. Again and again and again and again, dreams show us our future experience, our future learning experiences. So a dream, my dream about 9/11 was not a direct effect of that event happening in New York. It was an effect of my own experiences watching CNN the next day and my own thoughts and feelings about it. So that's important, because memory is the same. I don't remember, what's an example? I don't remember, Watergate. I don't remember the Watergate break-in. I didn't, but I remember lots of things I've read in my life about the Watergate break-in, and that's where my memories come from. Same with precognition. People do not dream about events; they dream about their own learning experiences. And a great example of this is a Houston woman named Elizabeth Crone, who she regularly dreams about plane crashes and other disasters. Her story is very interesting, and it's told in a book that she co-wrote with Jeff Kripal. But she was struck by lightning in the parking lot of her synagogue back in 1988, and subsequently started having precognitive dreams regularly. And her dreams, are often about disasters, plane crashes, things like that. But what she's dreaming specifically is the point of view of the picture, that she sees on the internet or on the news the next day. For instance, she dreamed about an American airliner landing on the water in New York, and somehow saw the passengers standing on the wings. Impossible image. Well, 6 hours later, what goes viral on the internet and on the news but the miracle on the Hudson, when Chesley Sullenberger piloted his plane to a safe landing, and all the passengers were standing on all these photographs went viral right afterwards of passengers standing on the wings of the plane waiting to be picked up by boats. So she's not dreaming the event, she's dreaming her own engagement with the news about the event, which is a crucial distinction. And it's one of the things that points to this being an aspect of memory. Other aspects are that, it works the same way as memory. It keys in on emotional things that make an impact on us. We don't remember every random thing we do in the day. We remember those things that stand out, those little hills, or mountain peaks sometimes in our day. Those are the things we remember, and those are the things we pre-member in our dreams. Those are the biggies. But memory has certain characteristic features, and precognitive dreams seem to obey that perfectly. They also obey, as I talk about in the book, precognitive dreams seem to operate on art of memory principles, and this is actually an idea that psychologists have started to come around to. So if you're familiar with the art of memory, it's sort of the ancient, what people did in pre-Gutenberg times to remember books and remember lengthy arguments, for instance, in a courtroom or whatever. You create a sort of an absurd image related to every element in your argument or every element in the poem or whatever, and then you place those images sequentially in a mental imaginary space, so like a memory palace or something like that.
Yeah.
And then when it comes time to deliver that or to recall what you had memorized, you simply mentally walk through that space and recover those images and reconstitute it that way. Well, dreams seem to be the same thing. They're operating on those same principles. And when you unpack a dream that has a clear connection, that has a connection to a subsequent event, it's like, yes, that's how it operates. Because often most precognitive dreams are not these literal, like video quality representations of some subsequent experience. Now, those do happen, but the majority of them are symbolic to a degree. So what you're dreaming is not that video quality, like you had a camcorder. You're dreaming a bunch of symbols that are assembled in kind of a weird narrative that unfolds in a spatial setting, like a dream. But all you do is free associating on those elements. And this connects to my love of Freud, because this was his great discovery about dream interpretation. All you have to do is just on each of those elements think, what's the first thing this reminds me of? And it's like, often it's just automatic. Well, yeah, that, randomly it reminds me of this other thing over here. It's those associations that are the target of the dream, not the symbol, the obvious symbol of the dream. So if you're just taking a dream literally, you're going to miss the vast majority. And this is another reason why we miss so many of our precognitive dreams, because most people don't have that mentality that they need to interpret, that they need to code or free associate on their dreams. They just sort of take the images literally and fail to do that second operation, because really it's that missing. Often the target of the dream is missing. It's like it's not represented. It's kind of the donut hole, but doing that free association very quickly assembles a picture, and that will create your connection to a subsequent event very often.
Yeah. I was going to ask you about that, because part of the dream work is it's not necessarily interpretation, which I think a lot of people get hung up on. And that's what I do. I'm like, what does this mean? But it's this association. Right. And in the book, you also note, and I think this is really helpful, the unconscious likes, sort of like dad jokes. It's very punny. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Dreams are built on puns.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's like the number one thing to look for in any dream. Is this a pun for something? And when you translate dream images into words, that's what's uncanny, is that those puns, somehow the dreaming brain is turning it's turning an experience into a sentence, and then it's creating an image based on that sentence that uses some other meaning of that sentence, and so it's operating. And I don't really go into this in the book, but this is something that psychoanalysts have examined, is the weird way that imagery and language are connected in the psyche, and it's fascinating. But it's very important. It's another reason why it's so important to write your dreams down, because the images have a linguistic meaning quite often. And you'll start to notice all kinds of examples of it when you start doing this work.
We're talking about Freud. Let's maybe say a little bit more about Freud. And I also want to ask you about synchronicity, Jung's concept of synchronicity, because you have a bit of a different take on that.
You want me to talk about Freud first, or?
Sure. Whatever feels.
Well, yeah, Freud is super important for all of this, because he was really, his book, The Interpretation of Dreams, which was what really put him on the map as a major thinker of the 20th century. In fact, he wrote it actually came out in 1899, but he wanted the publisher to put 1900 on it because he wanted it to be part of the new century,
Right.
And it was a really paradigm shifting book for culture, for the sciences, for the humanities. Ultimately, the sciences booted him out, because there's nothing testable really about any kind of psychoanalytic claim. And to be honest, a lot of his suppositions didn't hold water. He was kind of forced, as any great thinker does, they force fit a lot of data into a model that, and but there's still a lot of validity to that model, even if it doesn't quite work the way they think it does, or even if there are a lot of loose ends. And he really sort of mapped out a lot of the ways that the unconscious works, and that the ways for instance, the ways that the brain, he was a materialist. The brain will take an experience and transform it symbolically, and his understanding of that symbolic transformation remains very powerful. I mean, it's one of the most powerful, I think, interpretive tools. You can't do any kind of literary criticism or any kind of interpretive thing without really working with a lot of the tools that Freud really developed and advanced. So he's super important culturally, and especially in the humanities. He's also important because he was sort of straddling these two worlds of the sciences. He thought of himself as a scientist. He was really, especially in his early writings, he was really trying to link this to the sort of emergent understanding of how neurons work and how the brain was then understood to work. And he really thought that his ideas would ultimately mesh with neuroscience. And he was right, because in the last 20 years, neuroscientists have really come around to embracing a lot of what Freud was saying. But again, they do it with their own terms. They don't call it the unconscious, and they don't, they put their own terms on it. But anytime you're reading about priming studies or any kind of implicit processing is often called in the brain, Freud was the pioneer in thinking about that. And so a lot of neuroscience has really come back to sort of validating a lot of the things that a lot of his larger claims. I think a lot of people hear Freud and they think, well, what do you mean, like penis envy and all that stuff? No, I'm talking about the meta psychology. I'm talking about the larger idea of these sort of components of the psyche, this sort of conscious layer and a large unconscious layer, and how they interact. That's the importance of Freud. And of course, then he, one of his, his big protege for a few years was Carl Jung. Carl Jung's approach, owes a huge amount to his tutelage with Freud. And they diverged. Jung started to, detect that there was more going on in his patients' dreams and symptoms, and in his own dreams and symptoms, than this kind of reductive, sexual, this kind of sex and violence that we kind of associate with the Freudian unconscious. And Jung was detecting connections to myths and religion and so on. And Jung was also influenced by occultists of the time. So he was drawing, I think the idea of archetypes and stuff actually came from Steiner, I believe. And theosophy was a major influence at the time. And in fact, he was reading books that were put out by the Theosophy publishing house. A lot of his his interest in world religions and mythology and stuff like that was facilitated by the theosophists of the last century. But anyway, yeah, he was detecting this kind of this more metaphysical, spiritual dimension, and that has proven very popular for people, and has been super important in the New Age. And you asked about synchronicity, right? I mean, in the middle of the century, he published a couple of pieces about meaningful coincidences, and he was influenced by the kind of emerging, or what he understood or grasped with the emerging field of quantum physics. And he thought somehow this is going to help explain meaningful coincidences. And he envisioned a kind of science of how things happen that wasn't kind of this reductive billiard ball mechanistic unfolding of events in a thermodynamic universe that the physicists were describing, but it had something else going on. It was governed by meaning. Now, I say in the new book that he was ahead of his time, because he was ahead of his time in the sense that physics couldn't quite supply him with the terms, the concepts that he really needed. And so what he wound up doing in those books was saying, well, what we have to do is just get rid of the time dimension. That's the problem. We just have to collapse everything and say everything's happening simultaneously. Well, it's not so simple, I believe. And what physics has subsequently done is started to reveal the possibility of retrocausation. That is to say, causality operating in reverse, in temporal reverse. And this has been, it's been sort of there on the margins of quantum physics for a long time, but more and more researchers are saying, wait, this might be a new answer to a lot of quantum mysteries. And it's now being taken very seriously. It's not a mainstream interpretation, but it's growing in importance. And you'll sometimes see it written about as part of a larger rubric called superdeterminism. Okay, which also, all of it harkens back to that block universe model that we talked about earlier. The 4D space-time fits well with this idea of retrocausation. And determine causes happening in reverse as well as forward. Now, the picture that's seeming to be emerging is that there are really two regimes of causation. Okay, there's the thermodynamic billiard ball sequence kind of thing that gives us the world of material, object interacting and planets orbiting, and all that can really be well explained in that traditional thermodynamic model. But there's this other regime of causation that on the smallest scales, the quantum scale, causal sequence is indeterminate. Okay, it can go both ways, and quantum computing now is showing this again and again and again. I mean, just read any article about quantum computing in the last few years. It's like, seems like every month some new team is saying, yeah, we can reverse the sequence of a calculation in a quantum computer, and it seems to suggest that time, it doesn't work the way we think it does. Well, what a quantum computer does is scale up those spooky quantum effects, that happen on the smallest scales. And guess what organ in the body is thought by many people to be a quantum computer? Okay. So I think we're converging on a really interesting picture of beings, and not just human beings. I mean, living systems are also thought to be quantum computers. So this is operating even on a cellular level, and I think even with animals and organisms too. But you have, this kind of brute material, interactions that are just purely thermodynamic with a single arrow of time pointing towards the future. But you then have organisms and nervous systems that are taking information from the future and using that information and binding time in this four-dimensional way. And it produces these effects in our lives that Carl Jung labeled synchronicity. He wasn't able to advance this notion beyond just being a label, or a principle, he sometimes called it, but he couldn't, there was no, he said, well, there's just no causation at all. Well, in fact, when you zoom in on a synchronicity or a synchronistic experience, there is causation involved. And in fact, these experiences don't fall together in time, as he said. They involve very specific ways in which information seems to be reflexing from the future to the past in a human agent who is then creating a situation in their life that they have dreamed about or thought about or imagined beforehand. And it really, it's a way of, I thought of calling my new book The Anatomy of Synchronicity, because what emerges from this viewpoint is it's like you're shining an X-ray on something that had previously been opaque, and you suddenly see this inner structure. And you can not only see the structure, you can start to work with that structure and amplify these experiences in your life. You can start to have more synchronicities, by applying this mentality and paying attention to your own thoughts and your own life in a new way. And it's powerful to see it that way, rather than just saying, well, we just need to get rid of causation or collapse the time dimension, because I don't think that's very helpful. So that's my, I have sort of a, love-hate relationship with Jung. I was very, very much a Jungian for many years. And then, my research on this topic kind of drove a wedge, I think, there, because I think that the synchronicity concept for a lot of people, it just acts as a stopgap. They go, well, that was a synchronistic, thing. That's just the universe giving me the thumbs up or whatever. Right. But when you say, no, there's really something more going on here, and it's about you. It's about your brain, and it's about your life. It's not just archetypes that are somehow pulling strings in your life. It's your messy, convoluted life that's feeding back. And if you start to see how it's working, you can start to work with this and really intensify these kinds of experiences very powerfully. And that gets back to my love, I guess I won't say love, but my, ultimate preference for Freud, because Freud was really for him, the unconscious was a personal unconscious. He may have put too much emphasis on sex and violence and things like that, but it was not about archetypes. It was about your sort of messy, the mess of your life, the kind of the unique, the irreducible things that make your life totally unique, versus these kind of templates that I think for a lot of people, archetypes are kind of these templates that they can fit their experience into. But ultimately, I don't think there's a template for life. And that's why I guess I prefer Freud. You see, actually, ultimately, he's often seen as reductive, but I think he's less reductive than Jung in a lot of ways. He's just making you pay attention, the same way that a Zen teacher might make you pay attention to your to your actual thoughts and your actual experiences, and how every experience is unique and irreducible. You can't reduce it to an archetype. And when you have that mentality about your life, to really focus on your biography, that's what the value of Freud was. He got people to pay attention to people's lives in this new detailed way, like really delving into people's lives. And that's what I think is really, that's what precognitive dream work leads to, is this enhanced sense of your life as this unique, fabulous formation in the block universe that is like, you can spend your life exploring if you want. So I guess that's part of where I always kind of come back to Freud. But that is not to say that Freud was perfect or even a likable person. But,
yeah, well, I think it's an important point about the Jung and the acausality of synchronicity. And you do discuss causation. And maybe this is going back to where we started, in a sense, with the rejection from science, because you're actually arguing for this sort of retrocausation, a kind of a teleological model. And I think this is where things get kind of loopy, because you suggest that our present thoughts and experiences can shape our past. And I'm curious, does this imply that I can change my past?
No, it doesn't, because this is a crucial distinction. I'm writing something about this now, that people think that influencing the past or causing the past means changing it from what it was. No, you are causing the past means that you now are part of the backstory of your past. Okay. And that's mind-blowing to think about. But you are part of the causation that led to you being you right now. It is a looping relationship. It's very science fictional, and it goes against it goes against how we are comfortable thinking about our lives. But yes, this is the implication, because if you are, the point is, if you have an experience, I have it say I wake up with a dream about planes crashing into buildings, and then tomorrow, I see that on the news. We just think of that, well, that was a precognitive dream. But what that implies is that my thoughts today, having a conversation with you, influenced my dreams last night, or maybe a year ago. Maybe if there's some amazing revelation awaiting me in my inbox later after my interview, and I learned something amazing that I didn't know from an old friend or whatever. I might have had a dream about that a year ago. Now, most people who don't pay attention to their dreams, maybe that dream didn't have much of an effect on them. But if you have a lifetime of recording your dreams, paying attention to your dreams, and then maybe acting on the basis of your dreams, taking, honoring your dreams in some way, just making art based on your dreams, or whatever. I've started keeping souvenirs. I incorporate them into sort of an ongoing art project. I have a lot of little ways of honoring dreams that I have. Well, you know what? You are starting to building those habits. You are building the habit of retro-causing yourself in visible ways. I can now trace in my dream journals ways in which my thoughts on a certain day actually influenced a course of action in my past, and deflected me. There's a model in physics for retrocausation of shooting a billiard ball through a wormhole into the past at its younger self and deflecting it, and turns out all the math works out that when you do that, you actually deflect the billiard ball into the wormhole. So it's like it creates that looping relationship. Well, that's what you're doing. You are creating your past. And you're constantly doing this. We're just not aware of it. And so I think that there's like a fascinating psychology or philosophy or whatever in the future awaiting someone to write about. It's going to be a totally revolutionary new way of looking at the human being, to realize that we are constantly, causing our past, we're affecting ourselves. And the more we're conscious, and we amplify that, the more we're conscious of our dreams and synchronicities and waking, inspirations, any manifestation of what Freud called the unconscious is really, I believe, a manifestation of precognition, or this sort of forward in time thoughts, feelings, and so on, refluxing and influencing us. So yeah, the term I use in the new book is the long self, to describe kind of this unfolding biography, this landscape that's still ahead of all of us, that's influencing us right now in ways that we don't know yet. But when we get there, if we're paying attention, we can map out these amazing wormholes in our lives, and study this. And it's truly mind-blowing when you start doing it.
Yeah, it reminds me when I cover Aristotle and a little bit of Thomas Aquinas in my classes, and the idea of the prime mover, and I think many people think that the prime mover, which gets, with Aquinas gets equated with God, that's the beginning of everything. It's like this push. And I always say, no, it's not a push, but it's like a pull.
Yeah.
That it's pulling you towards it. And it seems to me that's kind of what you're arguing, this long self, that we're pulling ourselves towards our future.
Right. And what's fascinating is, and what I love, I'm sort of delving into more now, is how this translates, these same, if this is operative on human life, I mean, our lives can be kind of a model of what may be happening in the cosmos, right? And there's a lot of writers who've talked about not a prime mover, but the omega point, for Teilhard de Chardin, or Philip K. Dick was writing about this. The idea that the real, causative force in the universe is not back at the beginning of time; it's at the end of time. Right. And through time travel and whatever other things await us, the future is causing the present. John Wheeler, the physicist, had this. He came to this kind of realization late in his career. His model was the way that an observer can affect by choosing to measure this versus that in a physics experiment, you're exerting a kind of influence on that. Well, the fact that that's retrocausal isn't immediately apparent until you realize, well, the speed of light makes that retrocausal. And so he even envisioned an experiment where where you could affect something in the past, by measuring something at a distance. So, someone got the idea of bouncing a laser off mirrors on the moon and testing this over a quick span of like 2 seconds or whatever. And, sure enough, and, Wheeler was imagining, we could, that, theoretically, then observers at the end of the universe looking back at the Big Bang are affecting it. Well, he didn't even have a model of retrocausation as I'm describing it. I mean, that this is even kind of subsequent to Wheeler. But I think that we, or I'm sorry, not we, but the intelligences at the end of the universe or whatever are going to have a direct effect on all of cosmic history in a kind of retrocausal way. And so that's fascinating to think about. And it's a teleological model, but it doesn't imply God, necessarily. And that's actually interesting. The reason the Enlightenment has been so opposed to anything smacking of teleology for so long is that back in Isaac Newton's time, teleology meant God. It meant a miracle. No one could think about teleology that wasn't somehow God's purpose and intention. And so it was very natural for them to say, no, we can't, that's not fair. It's not playing fair to invoke miracles. So we can't invoke teleology. So it's been forbidden since then to talk about backwards causation because of that. But we're now in a new world where we can think about backwards causation without thinking about miracles, but it doesn't mean that there isn't an intention or intelligence behind causes from the future influencing the past. And we certainly see that in our own lives. I mean, honestly, I'm a more intelligent person now than I was 5 years ago or 50 years ago, 49 years ago, and so, yeah, there is this notion of increased intelligence, acting backwards, whether on the scope of an individual life or on the scope of a species or the cosmic history or whatever.
Yeah, I always liked Terence McKenna's phrase, the transcendental object at the end of time. Because he offered a very similar model,
right.
I think.
Yeah.
So, and this is a huge question with all of this. What does this imply about free will?
Yeah. Yeah, everyone asks that.
Yeah.
I have a different answer every time. I ask people to drill down, what do they mean by free will? What do you mean by free will? So tell me, what do you mean by free will?
I mean by free will that I have the capacity to choose, and that I see it as being non-deterministic in a sense. And philosophically, I'll just tell you that my approach to free will, because I have to cover this with the students, is that I don't know. All the evidence seems to me to suggest that we do live in a determined universe, which would imply, I think, that we don't have free will. But I also add that I still have to act under the illusion that I have it.
Yeah. Well, free will, that freedom to choose. Well, yes, I mean, we have the freedom to choose to the extent that we actually have that freedom. Like I raise my hand, I choose to do this right now. Now, if you took apart my brain and my nervous system and my soul and looked at looked at all the chains of events that led to that, that description would not look very much like I was free. It would look like I was determined, but my experience is very much that I'm freely choosing, and I experience it that way. One of the things that you'd find if you really drill down into all those chains of causation to my raising my hand is that there is an open, indeterminate element to it. At the quantum level, you cannot predict exactly where a given particle is going to land. Okay. And that's always, and under the so-called Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, that's always been said as just intrinsic in reality, that essentially God plays dice, and this really bugged Einstein. Well, what the retrocausal interpretation says is, no, there actually isn't any randomness, but those causes, that indeterminate element in a particle's behavior is actually coming from its future. It's influenced by the next thing that particle hits, is determining its history. And that's the fascinating thing, that okay, maybe you can't determine how I raise my hand, but maybe it's my future. Maybe I'm pulling my meat puppet strings from a point farther along my timeline. I talk about this in Time Loops a bit. And I think that's like, well, okay, I'm not free will, no free will. I don't think you can't, I think these are semantic problems. It doesn't change my experience, but it changes the way I look at my experience. And it's like a pretty exciting new way of looking at your experience. So I'm not really bothered by the free will question. Another way I often answer this question, I'll just say quickly, is that my tradition, if you want to say, is Zen. I'm a Zen meditator for many years, and I've, when I meditate, sometimes if I have sort of thoughts intruding or whatever, I'll just set them on a mental little shelf over here on the upper right portion of my visual field, I'll just kind of say, I'll just set it on my shelf. It's like, I'm not getting rid of it. I'm not destroying it or denying it. I'm just saying, let's just set it on the shelf. I'll take it down when I'm done, but I just don't want it, bothering me right now. And that's what I ask people to do with free will. Just kind of set this idea up on a shelf and just experience life without this idea of free will and see what happens, see how it changes you to think, to not have this idea of free will lurking there as a problem. And I've found that, I'm much happier and healthier without the notion of free will. It's baggage, it's sort of philosophical baggage. It's not doing me any good. Zenists, I don't think are very into free will. I mean, it feels like it's about being spontaneous and all that, but it's also about getting rid of that baggage about whether we have free will or not, just acting, and the less you're burdened by these pieces of baggage, the more your actions are effective and the more you're happy and more like, wow, you feel like you're in charge of your life in a way when you don't have that idea of free will there. It's paradoxical, but so I just ask people, just take your idea of free will, sit on a shelf. I'm not saying get rid of it, but you might find, as I've found, that life starts actually weirdly looking a little better without this problem.
Yeah. I had to ask because I do have a background in philosophy, but in all honesty, my relationship to philosophy, I think, is a little bit like your relationship to Jung. I have a love-hate relationship with it. Yeah. And usually I'm way happier just letting the mystery be, and, there are a lot of philosophical questions that I could ask you, not just about free will, but about consciousness. And I know in the book, you seem to kind of suggest, I'm not so interested in that question. And that your focus is on the unconscious and this question of time itself and our experience of time. I mean, it's so rich, but I like the idea that the focus is on the experience, the human experience of these things and working with the experience of these things. I know that we're starting to run out of time here. So I just have a couple more questions for you. The first one is, what's next? What's next for you?
Yeah, I'm right now, well, this is for several years, I've been sort of amassing kind of research for a book on precognition and creativity. And because, I think that, dreams are kind of the royal road to precognition in a way, but in another way, I think art is a royal road in the sense that, artworks, unlike dreams, I mean, they're already public documents and public, where we have them, we can examine them. And in the case of famous writers and famous artists, we have a life that we can compare it to, and we can start to examine the way precognition might work in that sphere. And so, very slowly, I'm working on a book where I'm looking at precognition in the lives and the work of artists, some famous artists that you wouldn't think of. And the Time Loops has a couple chapters on, like, I delve deeply into Philip K. Dick, who was famously precognitive, and also Morgan Robertson, who's the writer of the novel Futility that predicted the Titanic disaster very uncannily. But the new book will be all chapters like that, but all on a wide range of artists that are not thought of as precognitive. I mean, Tolkien, Kafka, things like that. So David Lynch. So I'm excited about it, but it's a lot of reading and a lot of research, and I'm going very slowly on it, but that's my next project.
Well, I see a lot of people identifying similar things from The Simpsons, where they're yep, The Simpsons predicted it.
Sure.
But with David Lynch, that was, I know you mentioned Lynch in the book, and I consider Lynch one of the gods that walk amongst us. but I was thinking in terms of Twin Peaks quite a bit when reading your book, and being stuck in the lodge. That's
Yeah.
probably the best example I've ever
Yeah.
seen of being in a time loop,
Right.
and I'll see you again in 25 years.
Right. Well, honestly, I think I think Lynch is fascinating for so many reasons. And of
Yeah.
course, he famously is a meditator.
Right.
He does transcendental meditation, but I've found that when I'm, I don't have time for meditation really much anymore. But when I am in sort of a practice, and I'm meditating continuously, life takes on an aura that feels very much like Twin Peaks. And it's like this weird mixture of comedy and threat, kind of like behind everything, and it's wonderful. I mean, it's just like, I feel like my whole life is like I'm living in this kind of Twin Peaks environment where there's so much going on that's funny and strange and all that, and it feels like that world. And it's like he's so tapped into to that reality, and that's why he's so, I mean, I agree with you. He's one of the greats, probably the greatest artist of our time. I would venture to suggest. But he's also a mystic, and he's really tapped into something pretty amazing.
He is. And I'll just say this, I don't want to open up any doors here, but in the latest Twin Peaks: The Return, that famous episode 8, a friend and I just kind of keep going back to that as this model of kind of where we are now. We sort of see, especially with that woodsman towards the end, who goes into the radio station, and he's like just chanting, and we're interpreting this as like the archons, and that there's this dark spell that has fallen, over the world. And so symbolically, it's, he's tapped in. He's tapped in.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree.
So the final two final questions. One is, how's your 2029 Tesla holding up?
It's great. It needs servicing. I need to take it to the service center, but it's like the service center for it doesn't exist yet. So I have to. It needs new lubricant. They're going to invent like in 2025, and it doesn't exist, and I have to like wait to get an oil change for it.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I had to ask. So where is the best place for people to find out about you and your work? I know that you have a couple places, I think, that people can go.
Yeah, I have a website or a blog called the Nightshirt.com. And I've been so busy with kids and day job and everything the past year that I haven't really posted much on it lately, but I do try to post my podcast and webcast interviews on there. And I'm on Twitter at the Nightshirt, again, all one word, is my Twitter handle. And my books, Precognitive Dreamwork and the Long Self is the new one, and that's available in bookstores as well as online. And my first book, Time Loops, I don't know how many bookstores it's in, but it's you can definitely get it at your favorite internet bookseller, whatever that may be.
Well, I'll put a link to the website and your books. Usually I provide links to bookshop.org because Jeff Bezos does not need to be any richer than what he is. But I'll put those in the show notes and the video description on YouTube. Eric, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed speaking with you. I'm a fan of your work now, and I'm going to be getting Time Loops. I need to read that next. And I look forward to your next work too. So thank you so much. All right.
Thank you. This has been a pleasure.
Thanks. Thank you.
And that's a wrap on episode 16 of Rebel Spirit Radio. Thank you so much for listening or watching if you are part of my YouTube audience. If you enjoyed this podcast, please make sure to give it a positive review on whatever platform you use to listen to podcasts. Your reviews really do help. And please consider subscribing. For those viewing on YouTube, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. make sure you hit that notification bell so you will be informed when I upload new content. For the time being, I'll be releasing episodes every other week with the goal of releasing them every week in the near future. I'm also working on creating additional video content for the YouTube channel, including book reviews, educational videos on topics concerning spirituality, the history of religion, and the religious response to the climate crisis. If you would like to support my work in creating free and credible material on YouTube, please consider making a one-time donation via PayPal. You can find a link in the video description or show notes. Your support makes this podcast possible. I'm Nick Mather, and you've been listening to Rebel Spirit Radio. Until next time, may you be in peace, may you flourish in all possible ways, and may you continue to nurture your rebel spirit.